Now, what about the while loop? I have no great place to squeeze it in here, though I will say you can also use a while loop to replace a for loop. So if we would want to replace this, we would have to manage the variable manually. Now, since I use I down there, I now have to use a different name because now we're initializing it in the function, and there we must only use each name once. So here I'll go with j, initialize this to be 0. And then we can add a while loop with the while keyword, then a condition between parentheses, and then your loop body. Now, if you put something like true here, this is obviously always true, and therefore this would give you an infinite loop, which you want to avoid because it will crash your application. Instead, here we could check if j is smaller than 3, and then here we can console log our code from up there, so these dashes here, and then simply increment j, and now we manually replicated this behavior. Though I will say, if that's what you want, you would go for the for loop. This is just so that we can have a first look at while. So if I reload, strong attack and show the log, we see our dashes here 3 times just as before. But again, you wouldn't really use while for that, you would go with the for loops. So let me quickly comment that back in and comment out the while loop. Now, a more realistic use case of such a while loop might be that you create some dynamic value in there and at some point of time you want to stop. Let's say you're generating random numbers, and I'm doing this here in the browser console, so I create my random numbers variable, and you have another variable finished, which initially is false. And then you write your while loop where you check for it not being finished, so with the exclamation mark, because this has to return true to make it into the body. And then you place your cursor between the curly braces, you hold shift and press enter. Now you can write multi-line code here, because pressing shift without enter executes the code. Don't do this yet, because then you'll have an infinite loop and you'll have to close your browser and reopen it to get back to work. So now we have the while loop, and in there, I now generate a random number with math random. Haven't used that before, but this gives you a random number between 0 and 1. Again, hold shift, hit enter to enter a new line here. Add it to your random numbers here. So random numbers push, random number. And now let's say we're done in another new line with shift enter. If random number is greater than 0.5, which will take maybe just 1 try or 10 tries, it's random. So if random number is greater than 0.5, then again, curly brace, hold shift, hit enter. Then in here, I want to set finished to true, which means then this condition will no longer be true, and therefore we shouldn't execute this loop anymore. At this point of time, I then also want to console log my random numbers. So if you now hit enter, this executes, and you see here, it does execute for me with 4 numbers that are generated, and this was the number greater than 0.5, after which it finished. If I repeat this code by pressing the up arrow here, which quickly recreates the code we just wrote, so the up arrow key on your keyboard, and I hit enter, well, now it doesn't even execute because finished, of course, was set to false, to true. So let's set finished back to false here, actually. And then thereafter, by pressing the up arrow key multiple times, go back to the while loop, hit enter again. Now it took 5 tries. We have 5 elements here. Though that's not entirely correct. Of course, it used the old array and just added 1 element, so it actually took only 1 try. Let's do this again. Let's set finished to false, and let's also reset the random numbers array to be an empty array. And now repeat while. Now this took 2 tries here in my case. Of course, how many tries it takes will differ for you, but this is an example where you might use while because you don't know in advance when you will be done. You don't know how often this will need to run because the exit condition is derived inside of the loop code. Now there also is a variation of while, and that's do while. For that, I'm back in our code here, and I'll bring back this while loop with j, and there we created these 3 dashes. Now, if I log j instead, let's see what that yields. If I save that, open the console in the developer tools and reload the page, and then press show log, we see 0, 1, and 2. The same we earlier had for the for loop. which makes sense. We start at 0, check this condition, 0 is smaller than 3, so we print this, increment this, now we have 1, smaller than 3, we print this, increment this, now we have 2, smaller than 3, and for a third time we print this, the value currently is 2, which is the latest value, the most recent value we see here. We increment this, value now is 3, this is not fitting our condition anymore, so we exit by that time. So this works as expected. Now let's say you actually always want to execute your loop body before the condition is checked, because at the moment the condition is checked before the loop body is executed, maybe you want to do it the other way around. Well, then you can use a do while loop. For that you can cut your body here and then add the do keyword and add your body here. And then typically you move while right after the closing curly brace, though technically it also works if it's in a new line. What this does is it now executes the body first and thereafter checks the condition. If you now save that and you reload and you press show log, you see we print the same as before because we still exit after this is equal to 3. But you'll notice a difference if you, for example, set j to 3 initially. If you do that with a do while loop and I reload here, and show log, you still see 3 being printed here. Now if we go back to the other while loop without do, so by cutting this and removing the do keyword, if we do that here, then you will see that now actually, if I reload here and press show log, we don't see the 3 here. The reason for that is that 3 of course is not smaller than 3, and here we check the condition first, but with do while, in which case, by the way, it's also common to add a semicolon after while, not a must do, but you typically do it in this notation, not after the normal while loop, but that's just a side note. But the important thing here is this code runs first and thereafter this is checked, so that's why we here see 3 being printed if we initialize j to be 3, because this condition, which actually finds out that we don't want to continue for j being equal or greater than 3, is only executed after we first ran this loop body. So that's while and do while. You typically will use for loops more often. While loops are kind of niche. There are some use cases where they're really great, but for the majority of use cases, you typically work with for and for off and for in loops. That just happens to be the case, the way we write programs and what we want to do in there. But it's good to have while loop, especially if you have some condition which changes inside of the loop and you don't know in advance how often you want to execute that loop. Then while loops can really shine.